Welcome to this video on understanding the fiscal framework. In the next few minutes, we will explain how the fiscal framework works and its importance in maintaining fiscal discipline and sustainability. The fiscal framework establishes a target for the primary result, which is the balance between government revenues and the expenses, excluding debt interest payments. Over the coming years, the target aims to achieve a surplus where revenues exceed expenses. If the public accounts meet the target, the growth of expenses in a year will be limited to 70% of the growth of primary revenues, which includes government tax revenues and transfers. However, if the primary result falls below the target, the limit for expenses in the following year decreases to 50% of revenue growth. There is also an allowed range for the real growth of primary expenses, ranging from 0.6% to 2.5% per year above inflation. Despite the expenditure limitation, there is an annual minimum for public investments based on the budget estimates for 2023, adjusted for inflation over time. The intervals or bands for the primary result operate similarly to the inflation target system. There is a target center and tolerance ranges for both positive and negative outcomes. For example, the government's goal for 2024 is to achieve a balanced primary result, which would be 0% of GDP. Under the proposed system, the result will be considered fulfilled if it falls within a deficit of 0.25% and surplus of 0.25%. The minimum and maximum limits for the growth of primary expenses vary based on Brazil's revenue composition and tax collection performance. If the government struggles to meet revenue targets, the real growth of expenses cannot be less than 0.6%. In good years, with significant revenue increases, the real growth of expenses cannot exceed 2.5%. This range will function as the new spending ceiling, replacing the previous rule that allowed for expenditure adjustments only based on inflation. Some expenses are exempt from the limit set by the new fiscal framework. These include certain areas already covered by the expenditure ceiling rule, which the fiscal framework will replace. The proposal also states that healthcare expenses should grow to 15% of net revenue and education expenses to 18%. These sectors will experience real growth above inflation. The complete text of the fiscal framework, sent to Congress last month, provides further details of expenses exempted for containment measures and sets targets for future years. The government expects the Budget Guidelines Law, PLDO, to include the Fiscal Targets Annex, outlining plans for the upcoming year and the following 3 years. Additionally, the Fiscal Targets Annex should be addressed the impacts of these targets on the trajectory of public debt over the next 10 years. The Annex will also establish criteria for the variation of primary expenses, adjust the National Consumer Price Index, IPCA, the country's official inflation measure. These criteria will consider the observed IPCA from January to June and the government inflation projections for the period from July to December. Certain agencies and entities will have individualized limits for the primary expenses starting in 2024, based on the allocations defined in the Annual Budget Law, PLOA, for the previous year, specifically 2023, with specific expenses excluded. For subsequent years, the values will correspond to the previous year limit. For subsequent years, the values will correspond to previous year limit, adjusted by the IPCA. The fiscal framework aims to promote fiscal responsibility, ensuring that government expenses are sustainable and in line with revenue growth. By establishing targets, limits, and exceptions, the framework provides a clear roadmap for managing public finances and fostering economic stability. It's important to note that the fiscal framework is subject to approval by Congress. and its implementation will require coordinated efforts from various governmental bodies and agencies. In conclusion, understanding the fiscal framework is crucial for comprehending the mechanisms behind responsible fiscal management and the implications for key sectors of the economy.